Okay, let's go. Where's Jen? All right. What do you want? Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Testing. Okay. You'll adjust the volume as I talk. Yeah, I have a pretty strong voice. Thanks for being here, by the way.
In this.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are ready to begin. It's been a little bit of an effort to get everybody registered and in, and there's probably going to be a few people coming in. But we are ready to begin, if I could have your attention, please. I'm Peter Singer, and on behalf of the organising committee, which you see the other members here, Charles Camosi, Francis Kissling, Jennifer Miller, we would like to welcome you to this remarkable Open Hearts, Open Minds conference. And I would like particularly to welcome you to Princeton University, both for those present and for those who are watching online, because we are being live streamed, so people all over the world can be and hopefully will be watching what we're doing and saying. For those of you who are fortunate enough to be here on the Princeton campus, though, as I say, I welcome you to Princeton. I hope you'll find some time somewhere in the busy program to stroll around outside and to enjoy the beautiful campus, fall foliage which is turning now, to look at some of the historic buildings. Just a couple of 100 yards away, over in roughly that direction, you can find the oldest building on the campus, Nassau Hall, a pre-revolutionary building which during the Revolutionary War was for a time the seat of the Continental Congress. And in fact, it was while Congress was sitting here that they learnt that Britain had agreed to sign a treaty to end the Revolutionary War with the United States. We probably won't get news of the same significance at this meeting, but I do think that we are doing something quite significant in the context of what has obviously been a very vexed political, cultural, and philosophical question. I've been to many conferences, more than I really care to think about over the years, but I think that this one is something special, something different. In the mix of people it has, both in the fact that it has academic and non-academics, which is not so unusual, but in the fact that we have people from across the spectrum of views on this issue, and given that it's an issue on which people are usually very polarized, it is unusual to get this many people together for a meeting like this and to have the kind of open discussion and civil and respectful exchange that I hope we are going to have. You will have noticed, I think, that in the registration packet and on the website we have guidelines that we would ask you to look at and observe in terms of the way we talk to each other and discuss these issues. But I don't want you to feel that that means that we have to hold back in the sense of being honest about what we say and what we believe. I don't think that being civil and respectful means that we have to hide the real disagreements that there no doubt will be between us. I'm a philosopher by background, and philosophy, since the time of Socrates, has progressed by dialogue and disagreement, and I hope we'll keep doing that. When people who are not philosophers occasionally turn up at philosophy conferences, I know this has happened occasionally. I brought someone along from outside philosophy, and they listen to the discussions and the exchange, and sometimes they're quite shocked at how blunt philosophers can be in telling each other that their positions are simply false and indefensible. And people have said to me, you know, that how is it that after this person has stood up and told you that your position is unsound, that you've made 7 different mistakes, each one of which would be enough to completely vitiate the position that you're holding, nevertheless afterwards you're quite happy to go and have a drink with him as if he were an old friend, as indeed he may well be. But that's the difference between focusing on the arguments and focusing on what we're saying and carrying over from that disagreement any kind of personal acrimony. I hope that we will listen to each other's arguments, that we will speak openly but civilly and without acrimony, and that we will be able to have a drink afterwards and talk to people whom perhaps we don't talk to very much in the rest of our lives. So let me just say a couple of housekeeping items. One question that I've already been asked a few times is, where are the restrooms? The answer to that is in the basement of this building. There are two ways to the basement. You can go out these stairs here and go all the way down. So it starts out being a wide staircase. When you get to the ground level, it becomes a much narrower staircase, but don't be intimidated by that. Keep going, and there in the basement you will find restrooms. If you don't want to use the stairs, there is an elevator which is over there. It's not a very big one, so it won't hold everyone, but it is another way of getting to the basement. Another question some of you may ask if you brought your laptops is, can you connect wirelessly? The answer is yes, you can. The room is wired. There is a network called PU Visitor, Princeton University Visitor, which is open. You need no password, no security, and you can connect to that for the duration of the conference. If any of you don't know how to do that, we have a few copies of a page that describes how to do that, how to find it, but it's just like finding any public Wi-Fi network. But of course, I hope that while you're in the sessions, you'll be focusing on the content of what we're saying and not using the wireless network for other purposes. The last thing that I want to say is, obviously, many people have worked hard to put this conference together. You're about to hear from the other three on the organising committee, but there have been a number of staff people who've been working on it, doing a lot of different things, but I do want to particularly mention Kim Gurman, who has had the main administrative running of this. I'm not sure if Kim is in the room at the moment or down helping with registration. I don't actually see her. Hi Kim. Good. Thanks very much for everything that you've done. Made this work smoothly, has worked smoothly so far, which is quite a feat, and I'm confident that we'll continue to do so. You're now going to hear from each of the other organising committee members, from Jennifer Miller and Francis Kissling briefly, from Charles Camosi at somewhat greater length, and so I will make way for them. Jennifer, thank you.
Okay, I think the microphone just works on its own. I want to start by first expressing my gratitude to Charlie Camosi for having the inspiration for this conference and the fortitude to see it to fruition. I also want to thank Mark Mercurio for putting me in touch with Charlie as he started the brainstorming process, and my fellow planning committee members, Francis Kissling and Peter Singer, whose dedication, talent, and simple work ethic were very inspiring and humbling to be around. I'm also very grateful to all of the speakers and participants who journeyed here, some from pretty far, to unite and lend a hand in reshaping the nature of the abortion debate. We're going to collaboratively try and clarify areas of disagreement, explore new ways of thinking, and engaging the other, and here's the important part, in friendship. Peter mentioned this idea that philosophers are very used to engaging each other and then getting a drink afterwards. I'm not so sure that we're so used to doing that in the life issues. So, many of us are invested with our identifications, we identify with these issues, we're emotionally invested, and I've heard countless stories where friendships have ended over these issues. So I hope that we're able to get to know the other person personally, and when we sit down to have that drink, we don't slap a smile on our face, but we truly engage and enjoy spending time with somebody. I don't think policy and legislation alone can bridge the abortion debate divide, nor are they readily achieved without the open-hearted and open-minded dialogue called for by President Obama and facilitated by this conference. This type of dialogue on abortion is not easy, as I mentioned, but I think it is possible and critical. It can help ameliorate the categories, attitudes, and behaviors that often divide us, and slow necessary progress and collaboration in promoting respect for human rights, public health, and in establishing just societies. So now on a practical note, Some have asked what will be the next steps after this conference. We, the organizing committee, discussed the possibility of future plans, but we have decided to first let the conference happen, evaluate the results, hear your feedback, and then discuss where the future or follow-up projects might be. One of the goals we have for this conference is that people on multiple sides of issues get to know each other more personally, in part because it is often easier to take seriously and listen to those one knows personally. As such, we hope that connections and organic collaborations emerge amongst you. Perhaps some of you will be inspired to run smaller versions of this conference on campuses or in organizations, or author joint papers. Also, the website will be open for comments and for evaluations. This site will hopefully help people who want to connect do so. Open hearts and open minds do not happen perfectly overnight. So in that sense, this is a long-term project that hopefully creates a ripple effect. Francis is next.
When I was getting dressed this morning, I'm Frances Kissling, I'm one of the organizers. When I was getting dressed this morning, I had a certain amount of anxiety. And I tried to place that anxiety. Was it something I had felt before in my life? Where was it coming from? And I realized it was that kind of anxiety one feels on the way to a wedding, when the groom's family and the bride's family are deeply convinced that their respective children are making a horrible mistake. This marriage is not going to last, and these people were not meant for each other. And then the families arrive at the wedding, and I thought of all of you, and having looked over all the registration lists, I know all the organizations that you come from, I know your faculty affiliations, I know your email, and so I know that there are people in this room who historically have a very hard time talking to each other, not at each other. And what happens at the wedding is that usually after a few drinks, somebody's uncle, usually the guy who is a little funny at the meetings and puts a lampshade on his head, takes the courageous step of going over to the other aisle and talking to somebody in the other family. And then he comes back and he says, they're not really so bad. Come on over. This guy and I have something, you have something in common with him. And so the families begin to come together. And so what I'm hoping, of course, is that this family, this community, which has a groom side and a bride side, will perhaps get engaged, begin a courtship. I'm not expecting a marriage, but some steps towards relationship. I thought a lot also about this concept of the open heart. I mean, we have here open mind, open heart, fair-minded words. Some of us are head people, some of us are heart people, some of us are gut people. I had an interesting exchange with Peter. I sent him an email one day and I said, Peter, how do you feel about this? And he wrote me back an email. He said, I don't know what you mean by feel, but I think. And so we all come with views on the issue, but we all come with different ways in which we approach the issue. And an open heart is an important element of that. The concept of the open heart is one in many religions, in many philosophies, and so we are bringing it here this day. One of the things about this issue is that for many of us, our hearts have become closed over time. We have been engaged in a series and cycle of reactive engagements. We say things about each other, and then the other says something about us, and we go back and forth through this cycle. And through that, the heart becomes closed. Many of us have hurt each other. I think we need to be clear that there is a personal, emotional cost, a kind of rancorous debate that goes on at times. And when you get hurt or you feel dismissed, your heart closes. So what we are hoping here is that we can discipline ourselves, because it does take discipline, to try to take a deep breath. My friend Laura always tells me that, take a deep breath, Francis, and listen to what people said, and then move on. And so I'm hoping that there will be many moments of deep breath in this meeting. I want to close with my ambition for this meeting. I've always had a fantasy of holding a meeting in which the requirement would be that nobody could say anything they ever said before. And that the audience had that, because I go to so many meetings where it's just, I know what you're going to say before you say it, and you know what I'm going to say before I say it. And that the audience has the right, or other people at the table have the right, when somebody says what they've said every time they've met for the last 25 years, end panel now, says time, and you have to be quiet until you can figure out something new to say. So I'm looking for a lot of new things to be said. Thank you very much.
Have you ever been to a wedding where two people were giving the toast and the first one was so good that you wonder what the second person is possibly going to say? So all Fordham undergraduates have to take a theology course called Faith and Critical Reasoning. And I teach this course a lot, being a junior faculty member. I actually enjoy teaching the course quite a bit. And I'm an ethicist, so we deal with a lot of ethics. We deal with all sorts of really controversial issues. So torture and killing civilians in war, or what might our duties to the poor be in light of our unbelievable privilege, or our possible moral complicity in torture and destruction of animals in factory farms. And yes, we do talk about abortion. Now, I teach these kinds of topics not only to keep half-asleep 19-year-olds paying attention in their required theology course, but because part of the reason why they're so controversial is because they're so important. Now, someone might say, well, why would you do that to yourself? I mean, this energy that you're trying to elicit from these students could, of course, be directed in a negative way. And I've been part of a classroom where that has happened. I try as best I can, though, to direct this energy in a positive way. And one of the ways I try to do that is by installing this virtue that I like to call intellectual solidarity, or intellectual humility. And I try to have all of my students read what I take to be the best arguments on all sides of the issues we look at. And I found it to be an effective way of introducing intellectual solidarity. In fact, some of my students are here today, they're going to be annoyed that I'm talking about this, but I'm just going to say it again. A quote that I use often in class is, whatever position you take on the issue before us, I can find 20 people way smarter than anybody in this room that has a different position from you. So think about it again. Scanning the audience and looking at some of your name tags, I can't really use that line today, but it's still helpful in that setting. And I just want to say how humbled and grateful I am to stand up in front of you today as we work towards finding new ways to think and speak about abortion. It's a tremendous goal. I also wanted to mention that I think there's a lot of energy towards this goal at the moment. Each and every one, I wanted to flag this as an important sign, each and every one of the speakers you'll hear from today did not make an honorarium a requirement for speaking. And many of the people you'll hear from demand thousands of dollars for places that they speak. So I think that says something about the level of energy, the level of goodwill, the need to do something different. And I have tremendous hope that that can be the case. And not only because of the issues implicit to abortion itself, which are as important as they come, but in particular because of the issues that sort of get the bleed in from abortion, right? So we all saw this in stark terms in the recent debate we had as a country over healthcare. We've seen it for years now with debate regarding embryonic stem cell research. We've seen it for many years now with regard to the debate over whether or not to use artificial nutrition and hydration to feed patients in PVS and other states. I think it even bleeds over into the issues of how we think about the moral status of non-human animals. There are many other issues. So finding a new way to speak about abortion is not just finding a new way to speak about abortion, it's finding a new way to speak about all these other issues that are impacted by the abortion discourse today. Now, the feeling of hope that I have today is actually just a larger, more intense feeling that I had about a year and a half ago during my doctoral commencement at Notre Dame, when our president was honored at the university with an honorary degree and giving the commencement address. Now, I know many of you in the audience have complicated feelings about that. There are many intra-Catholic issues that I don't want to touch. What I do want to say is the following. In some ways, the build-up to the Notre Dame Obama event was precisely what's wrong with the abortion debate. There was a lot of animosity, rancor, refusal to listen, refusal to engage, yelling, in fact. But at the event itself, the students in particular, some of whom supported his speaking and some of those did not support him speaking, really did act with open hearts, open minds, and fair-minded words. And that I took away from that moment a chance and an energy to maybe do something differently. And the energy of all of you today, I think, bears that out. So another point I want to drive home is, though the genesis of the conference was with that event, the conference as it exists today, right now, is really a compromise conference between the four of us. So much has happened since then. So many new ideas have come about. So many different structures have been proposed. So many discussions have been had. So many painful compromises have been made that what you see before you in your packets is really a compromise between the four of us. None of the four of us have the conference we really want. But we did agree upon certain goals, and the people before me have mentioned some of those goals already. But I just want to highlight a few of them and connect them to what you see on the conference itinerary there. So one of the goals we had was to better map our disagreement. I'm convinced that a large majority of the disagreement we have about abortion is based on confusion. And one of the ways to attack confusion is to try to map disagreement, I think. And so a number of our panels are designed with that in mind. Other panels, however, lend themselves better to another goal we have, which is finding common ground across divides. So the opening panel will do that in a major way. The panels on conscience, fetal pain, supporting pregnant women, reducing unintended pregnancies. These kinds of panels will lend themselves to common ground, or at least that's our hope. At least they create the conditions for the possibility of that. I also want to mention something too. A number of you have communicated with us, and with me in particular, that in scanning the panels, you had questions about the level of balance. So I want to say something about what the organizing committee had in mind when they thought about the balance of the particular panels. So our first goal was to balance people's views on the subject of the panel itself. And I think we have done a really good job of doing that, actually. We always tried, at the same time, to balance people who were pro-life, quote unquote, and who were pro-choice, quote unquote. But actually a big part of what we talked about, well, who is pro-life and who is pro-choice? And for some of the discussions, we just disagreed about that. And I think that's indicative of something else that connects to another goal we have, new ways to speak about abortion and to think about abortion. It's possible, I think actually fairly likely, I'm totally convinced of it, that the easy binary of pro-choice and pro-life often misses the complexity of the abortion debate and stifles real engagement. And so this might be a classic example of precisely that. Okay, obviously one final goal that I'd like to talk about is the goal of having open hearts and open minds. Well, what is that? Is that just some sort of throwaway line, feel-good line or something? What precisely does that mean? And in closing, I'd just like to highlight what you have on the first page of your packet, which is a list of the organizing committee's guidelines for the conference. I think those say in particular something about what we envision open hearts and open minds to mean. So the first one I want to highlight is, and I'm going to close with this, with the list of these, maybe 3 or 4, is that when presented with a disagreement, that we attempt to look at this as an attempt to learn something new rather than an opportunity to attack, defend, or disengage. And that, of course, will require us to really listen to what someone has to say. I know I've had to sometimes discipline myself. As soon as someone starts talking, I'm immediately thinking about a counter-argument or a counterexample or something about why this person really thinks what they're thinking and what's actually behind what they're saying. And all those things are really not conducive to really taking disagreement as an opportunity to learn something from someone else. In addition, I think it's important to highlight the fact that we're just going to discourage using imprecise, sweeping language and dismissive catchphrases. So let's not hear phrases like pro-abortion or anti-choice or the like. Let's presume goodwill on the part of our conversation partners. Again, let's not dismiss them simply because we assume we know what their real or secret motivation is. Let's show each other the respect that requires we take each other at face value and our positions at face value. This is already mentioned as well, but I want to highlight it again. Many of us have deep and personal feelings and even experiences with these issues. As we engage with each other, let's keep that in mind. But let's also be prepared to have moments where we feel uncomfortable or even irritated. Those are the key moments, I think, to think about. Well, how are we going to respond at those moments? And if we think about how we're going to respond in advance, it becomes easier to deal with those in the spirit of the conference. Finally, and again, this is reiterating things others had said, let me encourage you to just simply introduce yourself to people at this conference that you don't know. We are going to have several breaks. We're going to have a cocktail hour, which I'll be definitely ready for at 5 o'clock. We're going to have lunch tomorrow, and I'm assuming many of you will get dinner tonight and maybe even tomorrow. Maybe it's an opportunity to take some of those people to dinner that you talked to during the breaks. Maybe it's a time to learn, again, to see disagreement as a chance to learn something new and not have that just be a throwaway line. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we hope that the buds of friendships begin to grow here and that as we continue from this conference that they begin to flower down the road. But the bottom line really is that we are all responsible, all of us are responsible for creating and maintaining the culture of open hearts and open minds at this conference. And I really look forward to doing this work with you this weekend. Now to transition into our first panel, the only thing you need to worry about is sitting right where you are and doing nothing, except for the people who are on the first panel. Don't come up yet. I want to introduce first Laura Chasin, who is the director and founder of the Public Conversations Project. We are not the first group to try to do something like this. And so we thought it was appropriate that we engage others who had tried things like this before in an attempt to learn from them and point towards the future. And I want to personally thank Laura Chasin on behalf of the organizing committee for all the work that you've done in helping us learn from your past experiences with regard to this. Thank you very much, Laura. And let's turn it over to you.
Is it on? Okay. Let's work. So, thank you, Charlie, wherever you are. There you are. I want to, now that we're well launched by the organizing committee, I want to just say why I offered to make myself available to them. I regard this as a historic occasion, and I view the four of them as pioneers. And I see them as having created new ground for us in this place and during the time we are together. And I also believe that the fertility of this ground depends on all of us, and in ways that the organizing committee have said. And these ground rules, these are what in other situations are called ground rules, but here, these guidelines, they're not a throwaway thing. I mean, these are things for you really to pay attention. Every single dialogue I've done on this and other divisive issues have had some equivalent of this, that the participants were committed to honoring as best they could. Some of these guidelines are about attitudes, and some of them are about behaviors. And of all the behaviors that I hope you will work to discipline yourself, it's restraining the wish to persuade other people. I may not be able to change the wish, but if you would really make an effort to change your speaking, we are in effect creating a counterculture among us. It violates every norm that now seems to permeate every public discussion I can tolerate listening to lately. So we are also, by the act of participating in this, becoming pioneers. Now, I want to begin by asking you a couple of questions. How many of you have had a conversation with someone who has radically different views than you do about abortion that went really badly from your points of view? Could you put up your hand if you have had that experience? The light makes it hard to see. A number of hands. Okay. How many of you have had a conversation that the participants all would agree went really badly among people who you consider allies or people who are on, quote unquote, the same side as you? Would you put up your hand? I'm not surprised, because most of the people who came to the early dialogues we started in the 90s were people who had been badly burned by conversations within their own side of the movement and wanted a safe space to be authentic and to be heard. Now, here's the third question. How many of you have been in a conversation with people who have radically different views about abortion than you do that went well? That's wonderful. Well, I hope you'll think back to that conversation and think about what made it possible, what people did, what the context was, and draw on it, because you will in a way be dialogue 202, and will be, can be helpful to those for whom this may be new, and about those of you who may feel skeptical of whether this is worth trying. But this is what I hope you all will do. Now I'm going to come and sit down and join this wonderful panel, all of whom have been pioneers in crossing this divide in some quite different and interesting ways. And what the time is organized, there are three parts to this. In the first, they will each have 5 minutes to respond to whichever of the 7 questions they agreed would make an interesting menu. as many as they choose to or can in the time in their 5 minutes. And then they will draw each other out. They will have a conversation among themselves. It's somewhat shortened by the time situation, but we will have, no? Okay, you will have a conversation among yourselves. And then we will engage, they will all engage with you in a manner to be determined when we get there. So that's the plan. And this is your first chance to practice listening in the spirit of the conference. So pay attention to your thinking as you listen to these leaders. So Jen, do you want to?
I chose the question, what does it take? I have the softest voice. It's the worst person to lose a microphone right here. So I chose to answer the question, what does it take for someone who is pro-choice and pro-life to have a conversation with a person or people on the other side? And I came up with five thoughts. The first one is, be not afraid. Pope John Paul II, Michelle Obama, and even Shakespeare have all repeated these 3 words, and I find them appropriate here. If there is a best way forward, and in general and particular cases with respect to abortion, it's there. And with wise reason, we can find it. Now, if there isn't a best way forward that we can discover, if you want to call it an objective moral truth, then perhaps there's room for fear, because then we risk following the loudest, strongest voice, which can change over time. But since I do think that there's best ways forward that we can discover together, I don't think we need to be afraid of who and when we engage each other. The best way forward unveils itself in the search. My third point is we need to be willing to experience something I call epistemological vertigo while discovering the best way forward. I recently sat down with a pro-life Catholic colleague who shared a story that his wife of 30 years old was diagnosed with a brain tumor. In the 2 weeks between the diagnosis and deciding which treatment course to pursue, they created and froze 13 embryos, raising moral status questions, selective abortion, and many others. I listened to my colleague with a mojito in a hand with compassion in the true sense of the word, to suffer with, and I allowed my heart to unite to some degree with the suffering heart of my colleague. This union of hearts leads to what Faye Ginsburg says, internal tectonics. It's my physics side coming out, where the layers of our thought and unexamined beliefs begin to shift and collide and take a new shape in relation to the person with which we allow our hearts to unite, to be moved as we struggle to understand. You can use these transformative encounters as ways of gaining insight. When I told this story at a medical ethics conference in Michigan a few weeks back, my fellow panelist pounded his fist and said, they should have said no, they should have adopted. And I was literally shaken. I identified with my friend so much, I had never asked why he didn't consider that. Then I shared the story again with a Bioethics International board member, and she thought, we should all be dizzy when we hear this. This is a complex, somewhat unfair situation. And there are questions to consider. For example, Can you bond with an adopted child like you can a biological child? Incidentally, my mother is adopted. When we encounter these situations that make us dizzy, where we experience epistemological vertigo, I say be not afraid, because these are realities, some sorts of truth that in dialogue we affirm, examine, deepen, and use to rectify our own defining beliefs in relationship to another person, to reality. There's a rabbi, Rabbi Irwin, who always says, relax into the messiness, the complexity of life, without fear, while we collaboratively reason through the best way forward, and humbly adapt and conform to realities as necessary. My fourth point, we need each other. In a culture with iPhones, have it your way burgers, and MySpace, it's easy to forget our interdependence. No individual has all the answers. The talents are not distributed justly or equally. One might be more compassionate, more courageous, more just, have more humility. We have differences based on age, abilities, intellectual and moral aptitudes, social circumstances. But we need each other. We need institutions. We need the media to cover dialogue stories in which it might just look like nothing happened. We need to help our friends and colleagues to see a person who may think differently, not as an argument to be won, but as a fellow human being. And lastly, it can be done. ABC, the TV station, called Fargo, North Dakota, the community ripped apart by abortion. And yet that community at one point formed a group called Pro Dialogue, in which picketers of abortion clinics and patient advocates who walked with women through the picket lines to clinics and many others discussed, disagreed, and found common ground on the importance of reducing as much as possible the need for abortion.
Thank you for going first.
Someone know? You know me?
Start talking and then forget it.
All right. Hello, everybody.
Would you say your name?
I'm Rachel Lazar. So it's the fall of 2007, and I'm on my way to Legal Seafood at National Airport to go have dinner with a mega church pastor who I've never talked to before, called Joel Hunter. He had agreed to meet me on his way back from a meeting in Washington to Florida at the restaurant. So I walk in, I find him by description. He's in the internet. You know, he's like a generation older than me, graying, dressed in a suit. I go to the dinner table, you know, we order our fish, sit there talking, and I decide that I really had better confess all of my differences again to him, because I've asked him to embark on finding common ground with me on the divisive issue of abortion. So I start by saying, I'm Jewish. I'm a lakefront liberal from inner city Chicago, and I'm a veteran frontliner on the pro-choice side. That's my past. And now I'm here to say that I think that we can find shared values around this issue of abortion. And I asked him, would he do it with me? He responded by telling me, well, I'm a pastor of a 10,000 congregant church in Northland, Florida. I'm a one-time president-elect of the Christian Coalition. I'm pro-life. But I read your paper where you were proposing some shared values, and it spoke to my heart. That was the birth of the Come Let Us Reason Together initiative. I want to share 3 things about that initiative with you guys today. The first is some of the profound and positive effects that the initiative had on the issue of abortion. The second is the positive effects that the initiative had on other divisive social issues outside of abortion. And the third is the effect that this initiative had on me personally. So first, some of the successes on abortion. Well, after that airport meeting, the next time Joel came to Washington, it was to have a meeting in my office with 4 other evangelical Christians, including David Gushee, to my right, so that we could come together and talk about why we were all willing to embark on finding common ground on abortion together. Do you remember that meeting? It was a half-day meeting. something went right in that meeting, and there was some kind of trust that was created even from the honest sharing that we did in that half day. And before we knew it, we had formed a core group where we were able to successfully have a series of conference calls, once even a 6:30 a.m. breakfast at a conference we were all speaking at in Atlanta for Dave, and many shared drafts of papers. And a year later, we had our first success. We had a concrete governing agenda where we had a shared policy proposal on abortion that we took together to President Obama's transition team. And that governing agenda was intentionally 2 pages short so that everybody would read it, and it started with abortion. And I'll just read you quickly what the message was. Common ground on abortion means reducing abortions in America through policies that address the circumstances that lead to abortion, preventing unintended pregnancies and supporting pregnant women who wish to carry their pregnancies to term, as well as increasing support for adoption. And the approach involved 3 policy tracks. Okay, preventing unintended pregnancies, I'll just say it again, supporting pregnant women, and increasing support for adoption. That was our first success. Our second success was also in Washington, when evangelical leaders stood side by side with the president of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, and the vice president for policy of Planned Parenthood at the bill introduction in the House of the U.S. House of Representatives of the first ever of its kind pro-life, pro-choice abortion bill in Congress. The bill we call the Ryan DeLauro bill, which we call that because it's Congressman Tim Ryan from Ohio and Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut who did the bill together. And the bill has over 20 concrete, spelled out, fleshed out policies that we worked very hard. Where's Donna Crane? Remember that, Donna? We worked very hard together to come to agreement so that we could all stand there together, and we did. And we got over 20 statements of support from each side, from key people. It's long and weighty with long, thoughtful statements of people supporting that bill. The third key success that we had is that people like Dave Gushee and like Joel Hunter have now become people who my movement talk to regularly. Advocacy groups talk to them. The Democratic White House talks to them. They are part, Dave is here today, they're part of a conversation now that's happening on shared values around abortion.
Rachel, I'm going to ask if you could pause there and trust that somebody will ask you a follow-up question just so that we keep our time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, to be continued. Hey, David.
I am David Gushee, and it is a privilege and a pleasure to be here. We were asked a number of questions to consider, several of them along the way, I think. I would locate myself in this discussion as a fellow human being and fellow struggler with everyone in the room, as a follower of Jesus Christ, as somebody who is yearning for the kingdom of God to come in all of its fullness when every tear is wiped away and all the suffering of this world finally ends. I'm a Christian ethicist trained nearby at Union Seminary. I grew up Roman Catholic in Northern Virginia and became a Baptist when I was a teenager, and have been wrestling with both of those identities, I would say, ever since. I'm grounded, I would say, in the progressive evangelical tradition around people like Ron Sider. I'm deeply drawn to Catholic social teaching, and also deeply drawn to the earliest Christian moral witness with its holistic rejection of participation in violence. I've been writing about that recently. Its opposition to war and death penalty and infanticide and abortion and the gladiator games and every context in which people shed each other's blood. Mine is an ethics of the heart at least as much as of the head. I am repulsed by a merely rationalistic ethic. Ethics is for people, and especially for suffering people. I believe, on the basis of all of these things, that abortion as a routine social practice cannot be accepted. It must be resisted. I do not believe that access to abortion for any and every reason should be viewed as a fundamental human right. I do understand that it has been treated as a legal right and has been for 40 years, and that carries a lot of weight. I do not expect that even if Roe versus Wade were overturned, that the problems that give rise to the issue of abortion would end overnight. In fact, most of the problems would stay the same. A society with a 20 to 25% abortion termination rate reflects very deep human, social, and systemic problems that must be addressed at their core. This helps to explain why I was receptive to Rachel Lazar and the Common Ground and Come Let Us Reason Together initiative that she approached me with beginning around 2006, 2007. And why I have been very supportive of the efforts that carried forward in healthcare reform, in the Reducing Abortion Initiative, in the fiscal year 10 federal budget, and the number of largely overlooked provisions that Senator Casey got into healthcare reform. For me, these efforts are based on certain assumptions. Probably in this society we will not agree on what abortion access laws should look like. But some of us can agree that reducing the demand or the perceived need for abortion, and therefore hopefully reducing the number of abortions, would be a good thing. It would be a good thing for women, for the children that they carry, and for the society as a whole. To figure out how to reduce the demand for abortion requires good data. Requires good data on everything related to why so many women currently seek abortion. And this involves getting into the nitty-gritty details of what is going on in our society that is leading so many people to feel that abortion is their best choice or least bad choice. Common ground is possible among anyone who is interested in figuring that out and making a contribution to ameliorating that problem. And it's possible among people who do not demonize one another and can agree that reducing the demand for abortion would be a net positive thing in our society. In the process of several years of dialogue, I've learned three things that I'd like to say. One is that extremists tend to have similar patterns of behavior on all sides. They attack those who seek common ground. And this has actually driven those of us who do seek common ground into a sympathy with each other as we learn about the attacks that are waged from the extremes on both sides. I've also learned that those on the pro-choice side are deeply morally driven. They must not be dismissed or derided by people who would claim to represent the other side. Nor should women who obtain abortions be demonized or dismissed as amoral, as has often been the case. Those who are working in the weeds of the actual social and policy matters affecting abortion decision-making are often pro-choice, but they also often have the best data. And so everybody who cares about actually reducing the number of abortions needs to be in dialogue with these folks. And then finally, for me, everything about abortion has the scent of tragedy to it. We're dealing with tragedy here, and we must never forget it. And I hope we can never stop dreaming of a world without it. And that is my basic posture to this issue.
Thank you.
Okay. As you learned earlier, I wanted to take up similar questions to the ones David chose to take up. My own experience is that as we talk about finding common ground on abortion or reducing the need or number of abortions, the reality is that most of the time we don't want to talk about abortion. We want to talk about talking about abortion. And that within these efforts, which are good efforts that I support, there is a reluctance to grapple with the issue of abortion itself. So when we talk about reducing the need for abortion, we're actually not talking about abortion, although in some deep way we also are. And I think it would be important to deal with what that deep way was. But so in that sense, I want to talk about abortion. And I want to talk to other people about what they think about abortion itself. So where am I on this issue? I've been working on the issue of abortion, in a way, since 1970, when it became legal in New York. So I've been working for a very long time. What I really believe is that women, what motivates me most in this issue is my sense of women as moral agents. And that moral agency, that, tired term, I'm not going to say something new right now, that tired term about the right, moral right, regardless of legality, to make decisions about reproduction is essential for women to be recognized as human beings. So that's a core thing. At the same time, that which I believe is core and essential in a philosophical way and in a real way is not the only value at stake. I think that, it's a very high value for me, the recognition of women's moral agency. But once a woman is pregnant, it's not the only value. So in that context, I've had to grapple with this question of what do I think one of the other values is obviously the value related to fetuses and fetal life. Now I'm going to say something maybe new or maybe horrifying. I have a very deep respect for the category fetal life. It is a category of which we have all been a part. It is part of our humanness. Fetal life is what we come from. And I think when I think about abortion, I struggle with the question of how does my respect for the category of fetal life interact with the value of women's lives. And I don't say women's lives around dying, but women's lives in their fullness. At the same time, I have to be very honest with you. I don't have a sense of individual fetuses as possessing high value. So that's where I am. But that category of fetal life, which relates to many issues, research, stem cells, abortion, etc., is one I struggle with in the context of my respect for women's moral agency. I'm most affected right now by what I see as a coarsening, not polarization, not anger, but the way in which both people who are pro-choice and people who are pro-life and have worked on these issues for a very long time have to some extent been coarsened in their values or in their expression of value related to one or the other of these issues. Those who are pro-choice have difficulty dealing with this question of the fetus, and indeed disregard and often appear to be coarse about it. And those, and I'm going to stop immediately after I say this, Laura, those who are pro-life still have moved somewhat in their respect for women from the way they talked about women 20 years ago. But there is still, when I hear them speak, a coarseness and an absence of real and deep understanding of women's humanity.
Mary? I'm empathizing with, I have to hold I'm empathizing with Charles about having to follow all these eloquent speakers. I'm Mary Jacksteit. I think I decided this morning I should say that I'm from the first wave of dialogue between pro-choice and pro-life people. I'm reminded, looking at you all, of two conferences I was at in the 90s, mid-90s and late 90s, that we were very careful about half and half people who identified as pro-choice and pro-life from around the country. And it was different. It wasn't structured exactly this way. It was at Syracuse University, one, and the other at the University of Wisconsin, but not sponsored by the university. They were sponsored by a really tiny project that I co-directed with Adrian Kaufman called the Common Ground Network for Life and Choice. We were at the Search for Common Ground organization, and Laura and the Public Conversations Project were very close partners and advisors. And I'm very curious whether anybody in this room has heard of the Common Ground Network for Life and Choice. Oh, a few, thank you. We were sort of under the radar. What's very interesting about this first and second wave is that now there are national leaders and events on Capitol Hill, a kind of visibility to this that did not exist in the 90s. It was very quiet and pretty most of the time, although I was going through my 2-inch thick press file. So there was periodic attention to it. But I wanted to say, besides the obvious thing you would expect me to say, which is based on that experience of working with groups in 20 cities across the country for over a period of 7 years, is yes, dialogue is possible. Yes, people can develop relationships and even friendships, as Jennifer talked about, very deep ones. What from that experience might be useful to you to hear about? And that really goes to my sense of why people did this. And I can say that I identify with these reasons and why I was interested in facilitating this. One was a personal sense of disjuncture between a person's ethical or moral or religious values and how they knew they were being in the abortion issue. And that inconsistency with who I am and what I believe about other human beings and how I'm actually behaving as an advocate or how I'm behaving defending myself was a disjunction that was very troubling to some people and really moved them into dialogue. Second was people who, much like what Rachel and David described, thought that if people could talk to each other, they might do good practical things. So in some places that was working on adoption, in other places teen pregnancy prevention. But the one I want to emphasize, and I'm interested that Frances used this word to describe this gathering, because what was very powerful for people was a sense that the way the abortion issue was being debated and confronted in front of clinics and handled in town council meetings and etc. was either destroying or assaulting or undermining a community that was very important to them. These common ground groups that we worked with, and Laura too, were local. They were based in particular cities or states. And people weren't isolated from each other. They saw each other, and the way the abortion issue impacted them was very real and very personal. So Buffalo, Spring of Life campaign, after a couple of months, people couldn't talk to their families over the holiday table. Or Davenport, Iowa, where there was a loose connection of people who worked on social justice issues together, very successfully for years, and then Planned Parenthood announced a new facility, and suddenly their relationships were threatened. And in 3 places where there was violence, responding to violence against clinic workers or clinic volunteers, communities rallied. People came together to talk about that, to reestablish their sense of community, and to stand together against violence, and to try to prevent further violence, and to establish a sense of humanity, and to join against violence. So I would challenge you to think about, picking up Frances's term, is there a community? And maybe it's a community of interest, maybe it's a community, it's clearly not a physical community, but it's a community of people who care about issues about life, who care about issues about human potential and how people can fulfill that, however you define that. And how is the nature of the abortion debate undermining that, preventing that, betraying the values of that community?
Thank you, Mary. Now you have about 20 minutes to talk among yourselves, and I would suggest beginning by drawing each other out about what has already been said, or mentioning what it brought up for you. So, whoever feels moved to start.
I'll throw a question in the direction of Frances. I struggle with women's moral agency in this sense. when you look at Guttmacher statistics that 70% of all abortions are obtained by basically women who are poor or right up above the poverty line, and you look at basically who gets abortions on the whole, it's people who are on disproportionately the least privileged people in society. Right. It feels to me not like an expression of moral agency in many cases, but an expression of desperation rooted in systemic, lack of opportunity and lack of agency. Yeah. So, what do you think about that? I mean, with agency.
Yeah. I think that agency doesn't diminish. In fact, it probably increases the less privileged a life a person has. And so in that context, a poor woman, low-income woman, a teenager, the people we're talking about, who face these economic and other problems, there's a lot of desperation. That desperation is there no matter which choice they make. The choice to continue a pregnancy in that situation can be as much a lack of agency or a lack of privilege and right as the decision to have abortion. Those people have terrible lives, and abortion or having babies is not the central issue for them. But especially for them, because of the limited choices that they have, I feel, this is how I see it, and as I've thought about this, they need to be able to make the choices within the context of what they have. And just because they don't have what I have, I don't want to take that away from them. How does that resonate with you?
Everything still feels tragic to me. The whole thing is tragic. And it feels to me like you have two terrible choices. You choose in that moment what seems the least terrible one. But the focus of the efforts of all people who care about suffering people needs to be to try to get to the core of why so many people were in such desperate circumstances. And so I think there is common ground possible on dealing with that. But I do still have the suspicion that basically we have visited the bitter fruit of the sexual revolution onto the backs of those who already suffer the most.
I have a slightly different take on the sexual revolution, but I'm going to let it go for the purpose of this conversation. Maybe over a drink late at night we can discuss that. So I'm not so sure we're together on that. But I think that this, I don't want to monopolize this here, so I'll let it go and maybe we'll come back to it at another point.
Actually, a drink is scheduled later between us, so
That's
we're
right.
looking forward to that.
I have a question for Jen, actually, and we unfortunately didn't get, Jen was really sweet, and before the conference actually reached out to me and sent me an email saying, hey, would you have the opportunity to, get together maybe when you get here before we see each other? And I was not getting here in time, and she even suggested a ET or something, I forget what you call it, like a cyber tea, a virtual tea, and I couldn't even do that. So we haven't really had the chance, unfortunately, yet to be in conversation, but I thought, and I'm realizing that I'm a little bit putting you on the spot, but in a earnest way, not in a I got you sort of way. I personally really valued what Frances did in this panel already, which is when she recognized and acknowledged and articulated sort of what the other side was in the moral complexity of the issue. So as a pro-choice person, she was able to articulate her concern for the value of fetal life, or I don't even want to put words on it, it's also delicate, but that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you were tasked with having to put words on our side, on the pro-choice side of the issue, the competing moral value with fetal life, whether you'd be comfortable articulating that or how you see that or what you would say. And we've never had this conversation, so I have no, this is my question.
Let me make sure I understand the question. So you're asking me from a pro-choice perspective.
I'm assuming, first of all, that you're coming at this from the pro-life perspective.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we had this teleconference before this panel where we were asked if we were going to blatantly come out and say our positions on things. So
so my question is asked with that assumption, just to the best of my ability and what I've been able to learn about you. Mm-hmm. Assuming that's true, or even not. If it's not, that's fine too. What are the words that you would use to talk about what's in competition in the abortion issue with the morally on the woman's side, with the moral value of the fetus?
So I think I was starting to touch on this when I gave the case about my colleague who is pro-life and fertilized 13 embryos. There's this question of the value of fetal life. Does a fetus at all of its stages have as much value as a woman? And I read something preparing for this conference. It was a story about a firefighter. It was hypothetical. Firefighter goes into a building and sees a canister of 1,000 embryos and sees a little girl sitting there. And who does the firefighter rescue? And the firefighter is trained to save the most lives possible. But nonetheless, the firefighter will rescue the little girl. And I think that articulates to some extent, correct me if I'm wrong, a pro-choice position. And I think there's some validity to that. And I know a lot of pro-lifers who would agree that that's an area where we need to clarify positions, because there is an instinct to some of us to save the child in front of us and not grab the canister of 1,000 embryos. So that's one area. Does that answer at least a little small section?
It begins,
yeah.
Thanks.
Rachel, you're someone who comes from the choice movement, who was, as you say, a frontline worker in choice, and who then decided that there needed to be, largely from a political perspective, there needed to be a different approach to this issue. I mean, the origins of your own work were in the political arena on this. And I'm curious, as you did that work, which I would, as I say, it doesn't seem to actually have hit hard or directly on abortion itself, but played around the edges, around reducing, we can all agree that reducing abortion is a good idea. In those encounters with people who are pro-life, and I could ask, it could be a joint question to the two of you, to what extent did the exchanges you have in private go more deeply into what the partners think about abortion itself, to try to mediate or reach elements of common ground on abortion, as opposed to, as I say, the bleeding edge around it? And because that for me is that's a very big question of whether is all we can do at this moment in society is work at the edge of this and find other commonalities, or could we actually find commonalities around the issue of abortion? Is that a clear question? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Shall I start? The work that I engaged in finding common ground relied on the assumption that it was a huge achievement to get people of different point of views, of strong different point of views, in the same room at all, let alone agreeing on concrete policies from, birth control to support for pregnant and parenting students. So that was the goal of the work. The goal of the work that I did wasn't to find agreement on the legality of abortion, to find agreement on the balance of what the appropriate balance should be of the moral weight of the fetus versus the moral agency of a woman. That was not what the goal was. I just want to make that clear. So I thought that since it was such a huge achievement to be in the same room, that even to all come to the same table, which in this context meant every single person in the room recognizing that abortion is morally complex. And by morally complex, we didn't mean morally bad. That wasn't the word that we chose. We meant morally complex, which the assumption is that there's two sides that are in competition. And that was a big deal to me, that everyone in that room implicitly was acknowledging that that was the case without having to say whether the woman or the fetus came first in that instance. But what was interesting about it was, so that was sort of enough and big, and as we were parsing the policies and the nitty-gritty of what we could agree to, that was what we did on abortion. But what was interesting is, and I didn't get to this in my remarks, I apologize, but when it came to gay issues, which we, then traversed, which was even more challenging to a certain extent, that's when we actually did start to have this very open dialogue about how people felt about marriage between same-sex people, even though we weren't even tackling that issue. We talked about the transgender issue in a very earnest way. I mean, we didn't try to reach policy agreement on that, but we had those types of conversations.
David, did you want to?
One of the things that was most striking to me about all of this is Rachel and I became good friends. And I came to respect Rachel and her colleagues just enormously, and also to grieve with her in terms of the shot that she was taking from her community, who saw her and this common ground effort as a sellout to the cause. And so it's like people coming from warring parties come into the middle, and you're likely to get shot in the back, you might say, by the people on your side who believe you're selling them out because you're even having the conversation.
And you face the same thing.
Absolutely.
By the way, this is not just the pro-choice community coming down on people who step out like Rachel. The pro-life community does exactly the same thing.
Terrible traitor. Yes. Terrible traitor to the cause. And still, it's looked at that way. So, forged together in a sense by mutual bloodshed on the battlefield, in a rhetorical sense, just a sense of mutual respect, in a sense that extremism is its own kind of dynamic. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. And it's one of the things that's tearing our society apart. And so there is a positive good just in even trying. To actually have accomplished some things, I think we accomplished some things in terms of government policy and in terms of the rhetoric about abortion in the Obama years that have been constructive. So, but meanwhile, it opens the door for friendship and conversations and working together on other things too.
So David, I wanted to...
It'll go on.
I wanted to ask you a question in listening to you. This concept of extreme voices. In planning this conference, I received a lot of calls from certain pro-lifers saying that I was selling out. And I took hours, sometimes days, to explain why I had chosen to get involved. And most people ended up coming on board. But it worries me when we use the words, we bonded together because of the extremes. Because one of the criticisms of Common Ground is that it legitimizes certain voices. And I think every voice is legitimate and should be heard. And that's why I started with no fear. So I'm just interested to hear what you think about this idea of extreme, because that label of extreme also can change over time. And heavens forbid, another group bonded together and somehow we became the extreme. So how do you reconcile Common Ground, united voices, and the labeling of certain positions or people or groups as extreme, knowing that I do it too?
Yeah, I'm not proud of using that word extreme. I just have experienced it enough times that it comes to me. I would say every voice belongs to a person. Every person should be treated with respect. And their ideas should be treated with respect and should be engaged. I also think that Jesus taught we are to go and talk with those who we consider to be our enemies. That is a moral obligation for those who are followers of Christ. We don't have a choice in the matter. We must go and talk. And so any invitation to go and talk, my predisposition is to say, let's have a conversation.
But would you bring them into a Common Ground conversation?
Yeah, as in like the more radical voices to my right, say, or whatever, like
on both sides,
or whatever. Talking, as we've kind of been mentioning from the beginning here, requires predisposition.
Yes.
There are people who are not interested in talking. They're interested in attacking or shouting. And such voices would make a conversation very difficult to have.
So last thing, and then I don't want to monopolize this. I have found we sometimes have made these labels and opinions, and they are different groups, such as there's right now in New York City, some media is going after some crisis pregnancy centers and some of the picketers of abortion clinics. And that side feels that they have not had a voice and a chance to talk, and that they are interested in participating in Common Ground, but sometimes they're not able. And I've heard on the other side too, because we've labeled them as extreme. And I think maybe if we did give them an opportunity over time, maybe they would take longer to adapt those skills. Maybe they haven't had a chance, they've been coarsened, somebody used that word, toughened. But I think that's something to pay attention to in our own work.
Mary, did you want to get in here or ask?
Well, it's somewhat it's actually maybe a little bit repetitious of the last line of questions, but it maybe just as the next step, which is how important, if the goal is to, if the overall goal is to shift the dynamic of the abortion issue, and you've all described that in various ways, how important is the dialogue, quote unquote, on each side? In other words, back in the day, we talked a lot about how do people transition back to their community? That in those days, the dialogue was not like sort of an alternative to being pro-life or pro-choice. It was something you did in a certain time and place, and then but your primary community was sort of how you identified on abortion. The last few minutes sounds like that Jennifer's perhaps perception is that Common Ground has become kind of a third place that's separate from pro-choice and pro-life. So is that your perception? And how important is it to keep the links with your own movement, however you describe that?
I actually would like to ask if there's a logistical person in the room. All of the people who are sitting in this area have the sun shining on them, and they're really squinting, and I thought they were squinting because they didn't understand us or didn't like us, but I then realized that it was the sun, so if we could close the ones over there, it would be great. Well, then I think we might have to do it for a little while till the sun goes down.
Wow.
That's a typical Peter Singer movement. You know, we know the thing, let there be light, and we all know that Peter Singer is let there be darkness.
I would just answer your question by saying, I think there is a kind of a third reality emerging. And to me, the factual basis of this third reality is, or third group, no matter what the laws about abortion access would say, we would still have the same empirical problem. We would have a demand. And there are social realities contributing to the demand. And suffering people, they need help. And anybody who is prepared to find constructive ways to bring help where it is needed is on the same team in a fundamental way. And I think there's no time limit on that project. It's a cultural reality.
I think that what Jennifer raised, I actually had exactly the same reaction when you used the word extreme. I said, I'm not so sure about this, and Mary and Jennifer too. I think there's a way in which when you step out the way you have done, or Rachel has done, or some people have done, that, and I to some small extent have done, I think it's especially important, even if you can't talk with everybody, that everybody can't be at the table, and that some people will self-select not to be at the table, and some people will be too difficult to be at the table, and sometimes you do have to set limits in that sense. But what's important to me is that at least on my side of the table, I don't consider my colleagues who are working for a totally, from that principle I articulated at the beginning. I respect that work that they are doing. I happen to have some disagreements with it, but they're not disagreements at the level of principle. I've decided that some other principles are coming into and values are coming into me that I want to honor as well. But I'm still, and I think that those of us who do this common ground work, and I don't really consider myself to do common ground work, but I think I do something else, but have got to respect and not trash the past, not overemphasize the horrible state of affairs that exists and the deep polarization and the this and the that, and it's all so awful, and all these pro-life and pro-choice people at the ends of the spectrum are just ruining America. And here we are, the saints before you of great moderation who are going to fix it all. And that's not the way it is. So, and I think sometimes we come across a little self-righteous.
That's good.
Do you have something quick? Because it's time to shift gears.
I was just going to say, I mean, rather than, asking to be the saint, I think I'm, finding myself asking not to be the, the Antichrist. Yeah, I mean, it's really bad. It was really bad for me. And that was what I was going to say about my personal reaction, to finding common ground in my experience, which is, aside from the fact that I'll never stereotype a group of people again, and that was like the first lesson learned, that some people from the pro-choice community didn't just try to kill the work that I was doing, which is one thing, and that's their prerogative, but they actually carry personal vendettas now against me because of what I did, and that was painful. So.
Okay, now at this point, I'm going to shift and turn to the audience and actually ask all of us to take a minute, maybe a little bit less, to just reflect on what you have heard so far. What surprised you? What interested you? What puzzled or disconcerted you? What would you like to hear more about? If you could only ask one question of one or more of the panelists, what would it be? And I suggest you write it down. You actually think of a question, and whether or not you get a chance at the mic, that question could be something that you could use in introducing yourself to someone else tonight. So let's just have a minute of silence, maybe a little less, but just for reflecting on this rich conversation. Okay. Now, what I would like is 4 or 5 people to come to a microphone and to say 3 things. To give their name, 1 affiliation that's relevant to your being here, and ask a question, a genuine question. No embedded assumptions. And then, the hardest thing at all, if you've got assumptions in your questions, I'll pounce and send you back to your seat. No, but, and then to simply sit down. Now, more than 4 or 5 people have come. There will be another wave, but the way this is going to work is you're going to ask the question, we'll get 4 or 5, you will make notes, and then they will respond as they feel moved to what they have heard. They will not respond to each question one by one. So, Carmen, do you want to start off? Just a question.
Okay, Carmen Barroso, IPPF. I have 2 questions, but they are the same. Rachel mentioned abortion is morally complex, not morally bad. How can you ensure that one does not become the other? Or meaning, how can you, for instance, fight for diminishing the need for abortion without stigmatizing abortion?
Thank you. I'm going to, over this side, please.
Hi, I'm Kate Cockrell, and I work at the University of California, San Francisco with the Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health program. And I was really caught by the conversation that happened between Francis and David about...
Is there a question?
Yes, there is.
I'm going to be really...
Okay, very quickly. I want to understand what you think the limitations are in how we measure people's attitudes towards abortion currently. And if you think there are limitations, a lot of people have limitations in the way that we measure public attitudes towards abortion and how that affects how we understand this debate.
Thank you. Okay, on this side.
Sunny Anand from University of Tennessee Neuroscience Institute. My question is the finding of common ground, between sort of pro-choice and pro-life, perhaps we need to ask the question as a society, what is the most loving thing we can do for this mother and her fetus? If it means, terminating the pregnancy, offer that, or arranging for adoption. So how can we as a society have a pro-love movement in order to help this debate, rather than becoming more morally complex, to simplifying it?
Thank you. I hear a question mark right there. Very good. Now, I'm going to take one more from here and then one more from here, and then we'll have another wave. So those of you who are standing may want to go to your seat. Thank you.
I just want to thank you very much. I think it's extremely fruitful what's happening. My name is Melanie Baker, and Francis, I was very touched by your opening statement, and so my question is more directed toward you. I'm wondering if there is a necessary opposition between the moral agency of a woman and the value of the child that she carries, like if the opposition is necessary.
Thank you. And then over here.
My name is Matthew Westfox. I'm a United Church of Christ minister, and I work with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And I'm wondering, when I talk to people outside of the debate, it seems religion is often seen as the reason why it's such an extreme debate. But I'm wondering, as part of this conversation about creating common ground, where you see the role of religion in creating common ground around this topic.
Thank you very much. Those are really great questions. So now, there's a past agreement. You answer the questions you feel moved to respond to, and so between you, one of you start, and others chime in, and then we'll go to another question. So, who wants to start?
I can start real quickly on the last question, which is many of the people who were motivated to be involved in Common Ground, and I want to say the Common Ground, we used it differently back in the project I ran. It was dialogue. It wasn't aimed at any particular agenda. Were religious folks. Buffalo, they were the Buffalo Chamber, what do I want to say? The group of religious congregations in Buffalo. So it was very common for people who are interested in dialogue to be moved by religious motivation.
Are there others who want to add on?
I can, sorry. Do people want to add to that?
Yeah, if other people want to respond, that's great.
I think that religion can be the most healing force in society or the most divisive, and it has to do with the way we direct our religiosity and whether it is directed towards stigmatizing the other or towards reaching out in love towards suffering people and towards healing and reconciliation. And when it does that, religion can be a very fruitful source of good.
I'd like to partially answer, because it would take too long to give a big answer, the question around is moral agency and fetal value necessarily in conflict? And I want to say that the answer is yes. At times they are. And the way I have been trying to work through this, which is to come out of and away from the Catholic approach, is to get rid of the whole idea of evil. I mean, I know there's evil in the world, but in this case, I think what we have are competing goods. And that's often the nature of the ethical enterprise. Two good things coexist, and sometimes only one can survive, or one can be honored at a given moment. And that is sometimes what happens in a pregnancy. There is the good of new life and reproduction, and there is the good of women as decision makers and moral agents. And I think for me the thing is not to see this as one is an evil and one is a good, but to see them as two goods, so in competition. So that's sort of what I would do with that. And I think, Carmen, just to say one more word on the question that you asked, I think that's an element of this question of how could one talk about moral complexity of abortion without talking about or making an assumption that one course of action is a morally evil or bad action. If you look at this as two goods, at least two goods, and probably 15 goods when you start unpacking it, in conflict with each other.
And I wanted to add to that actually and respond to Carmen's question, because I was asked that a lot, you can imagine. How does morally complex not become morally bad and not ultimately stigmatize abortion? And my answer remains the same, which is calling abortion morally complex is not in any way changing the playing field. Americans all know that abortion is morally complex. In 2006, we did a poll, and we had a series of statements, and we asked, do you believe this, yes or no? It was that kind of a thing. So one statement said, the decision to have an abortion should be between a woman, her family, and her doctor. That one was about a woman's moral agency. And that's sort of the way to ask the question to get about as high a result as you can. 72% of people, respondents, said, yes, I agree with that statement. Later, in the same battery of questions, of statements was, I believe that abortion is the taking of human life. 69% of respondents said yes, and I agree with that statement. 72-69. Saying that abortion is morally complex doesn't do anything to change the playing field about abortion.
Somebody asked a question about what the most loving thing we can do for women is, and let that be our guidepost. While that sounds very noble, and I agree with you, I think it poses a similar challenge to what you're seeing right now, in that we don't agree on what the most loving route is. It's the same arguments that come up with what is the good. And I've sat on many common ground panels on not just beginning of life issues, but end of life issues or resource allocation. And what one person thinks is the good, the well-intended good person next to them disagrees. That's not their good. And so I'll just demonstrate it with Francis. So I don't think abortion is a moral good, but I do think it is complex. And the reason I don't think it is a moral good is because I run towards a good. I want a good. And something that's complex, I don't necessarily run towards. And I think that most women don't run towards an abortion in the sense that they get pregnant to have one. So that's where we might disagree, but agree on a lot of other things as we've come to know.
The only thing I would add is I think abortion is a moral tragedy. Tragedy has a layer of complexity. Has to do with the least, maybe what is perceived as the least bad option, but never as a positive good. I would also, I've been struck in doing a little bit of research on the early church on its opposition to abortion was also related to its concern for women. So the women and fetuses and infants were knit together in a community of moral concern. And the only way to really make a positive contribution on this issue from my perspective is to care about both. You have to care about both and to see the way in which they're inextricably related.
But can your care about, is this okay? Can your care about both include the notion that for a specific woman, the decision to have an abortion is good for her? Or is that like totally off the radar screen?
I can't call it good.
I mean, I'm not asking you to call the abortion good, because I understand the difference between objective and subjective and all that stuff.
Can I actually add on to this? Since we're at this place, even if you don't call it a moral good, the question that I have for you, David, is can you see how a woman facing an unwanted pregnancy in the wrong circumstances to become a parent, there's something innately human about wanting to have control over your reproductive destiny in your body, and therefore there's something depriving her of something really important to human existence about not taking away that agency in that moment.
I do see that. But I think the choice is actually far more limited than it is often made out to be. It's kind of like, to me, it's more like the image of gnawing your leg off if it's been caught in a trap. It's a choice. It's the least bad choice in the circumstance, but it's a tragic choice.
I think there was a question over here about polling and about
the limitations of how of what we know about what people think.
Does anyone want to respond to that in some way?
I think that the limitations are, I think yes, that there are limitations. We don't ask, we in the same way as we say the debate has become stale, we tend to be asking the same questions because the way research works, you want to ask the same question every year for 40 years to see if there's any change. And the world has changed. And so in that context, we need new questions to really dig deeper into the complexity of what people think about abortion. We don't do a good job.
I would just say briefly, I think it's also, there was a recent poll in the last year that was, the headlines were, American public majority is pro-life. And that's putting a label, a conclusion on what was much more complex. So rather than the media saying Americans' views are complex, like you talked about, and show that there's conflicts between this and that, it gets this really quick headline.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask, there were the people who came to the mic before and didn't get a chance to speak. If there are any of you who still want to ask a question, why don't you come back? Just four or five. Okay.
Hi, my name is Father Matthias Kim. I'm a Catholic priest from Toronto. Francis pointed out how the pro-life side has improved their language or understanding of the goodness, siding with the woman. And you said that the language on feeder life is still coerced. I think it's not. I wouldn't agree with that. But my question is to Rachel, because I also think in pro-life movement, the language on feeder life also has evolved very much. Now, I'd like to ask Rachel, over the last 30 or 40 years, from the pro-choice side, because I picketed with signs saying abortion kills, 20 years ago. And I wouldn't do that now. It would be much more sophisticated about that. But how has the language of the pro-choice has evolved during these years to make dialogue possible? Thank you.
Very good. As I see the number of people who've come forward, will you try and make your questions tight? Thank you. I don't think. Is that all right? Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessica Ahrens with the Women's Health and Rights Program at the Center for American Progress. I had a question primarily for Reverend Gushee. I wanted to explore more the concept of abortion as a tragedy. My question to you is whether you see miscarriage on a societal level as a tragedy. Obviously, it can be for individuals and families involved. But if your answer to that question is no, what is the distinction you draw between miscarriage and abortion as a tragedy on a societal level? Thanks.
Perfect role model. Thank you.
Steve Tarnoff, Planned Parenthood. I'd like you to deal with the term pro-life, pro-choice, because I don't see a difference in the two.
Thank you. Wow, this is great. We can maybe have 6.
Francine Cueto, Pro-Choice Alliance for Responsible Research. To make it more complex, could any of you address the rights and the feelings of the man or the father involved as well, please?
Thank you.
Tim Likens, I'm a musician in New York City, and this comment or question is from Francis Kissling's comment, but any one of you are more than welcome to answer it. When I heard the comment, I do not have a deep respect for the individual fetus. That saddened me because that establishes your individual femininity as women.
Can you move on to the question, if possible?
Okay. How does a woman build a sense of being secure and having a deep respect of oneself as a woman when you don't respect the fetus, which is a major part of being a woman? And how do you build confidence and security in young girls with this thought, and when that's a major part of having an abortion?
Thank you.
My name is Jen Roth. I'm with All Our Lives. I'd like to direct this primarily to Ms. Kissling, but of course anybody who would like to answer. When we talk about women's moral agency and the value of fetal life being in opposition and that you have to choose one or the other, I would like to propose, is it not possible to believe in a woman's moral agency, in a woman's right to make decisions about her life, but that, as with all of us in different areas of life, that there are limitations on that? Does that negate, believing in a woman's moral agency?
Thank you. Okay, panel, is that enough questions to handle? Or wait a second, let me just...
Yeah, me too.
Well, it's a choice. We can hear all of them and then have one.
Let's hear them.
Okay, good.
My name is Curtis Hannum. I work at the Cherry Hill
Women's... Speak up a little bit, please.
Curtis Hannum, work at the Cherry Hill Women's Center, an abortion facility in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And my question specifically is for Rachel and David. In the dialogues that you had, was there any disagreement in the group about the morality of adoption?
Thank you.
I'm Sharon Long from Feminists for Life. Could you comment more, this is for the whole panel, on the role of the politician? Many activists resent politicians whom they feel are not sincere, but who are trying to curry favor. What role does a politician have in dialogue, etc.?
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Susan Schewel from the Women's Medical Fund, and you all have talked about fetal life. Most abortions occur in the embryonic phase of pregnancy, and I wondered if you're using fetus to refer to all stages of pregnancy or if there is some way to differentiate.
Thank you very much. Now, there are a lot of great questions in there, whether or not you can all answer all of them in the time, but still, the questions are in the room, and they're, happily, this is the beginning of the conference, so
Yes.
there will be time to answer them in other contexts. So, take it away.
All right. Since you asked me the first question, I will give you the first answer. Thank you for your question. Has the language on the pro-choice side changed over the last, decades in the way that you think the language on the pro-life side has? I think more than just the language on the pro-life side has changed in the past decades. I think that the pro-life movement used to define itself by being the side that marched with fetuses in jars and bombed abortion clinics. And that then the movement made a huge titanic shift to being abortion regulators. And that really began to win the battle of reasonableness for a lot of people. And that on the pro-choice side, that we largely stayed the same. That we have been about a woman's right and a woman's body, and we largely stayed in one place. I do think in recent years that the pro-life side, and Feminists for Life, Sharon I think was from there, I think has done a lot of this, has swung over and started talking a lot more about the woman. And in their case, it's not the moral agency of the woman, it's concern for the woman. And David was talking about that. And I think on the pro-choice side, that by the work that we've done and by Planned Parenthood and NARAL coming along ultimately on the Ryan DeLauro bill and things like that, which was big, it was really big for them to do that. It took a while. That is an acknowledgement of the moral complexity of abortion, which, while it doesn't sort of name the fetus or the embryo becoming fetus or anything, it's getting closer. And I think the reason that that's happened, the last thing that I'll say, on both sides, is because abortion is ultimately about a woman and her fetus. And that the pro-life side has traditionally won by shining the spotlight on the baby, the fetus, and the pro-choice side has traditionally won by only shining the spotlight on the woman, but that both sides have come to recognize what all Americans believe, which is they know both are involved. And so in order to win, even, and to make advances on their side, they have to speak to both.
Maybe I'll follow in the order, the miscarriage versus abortion question. I'll answer it theologically. The high percentage of pregnancies that end in miscarriage, and we went through this twice, my wife and I, illustrate the brokenness of creation. No choice involved, no volition, life ends prematurely. And for those who go through it, it's devastating, or can be, as it was for us. For an abortion is an elective decision to end a developing pregnancy, and there's a different layer, a different meaning there because of the choice that is involved. My moral perspective is that any time we choose to kill, we participate in the tragic, and that morally we should be doing all that we can to limit the number of cases in which we make that choice. And that's across the board for me: death penalty, war, and abortion.
Piggybacking on that, I'm pretty sure everyone in here knows this, but there's something called the natural fallacy, that just because something happens in nature doesn't necessarily mean it's something we want to repeat on purpose. So I would make that distinction.
I'll say a few things. To the young man who was saddened by my expression that I do not have a high value for individual fetuses, what I want to say about that is, first of all, we're going to talk about that in the next panel. There's going to be a whole discussion about the moral status of the fetus, and I think some of that will be developed in that, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But I think that there is a certain reality that goes far beyond me, and that is that for most people who are pro-choice on abortion, a big part of that is the conclusion that we have reached based upon our examination and study of science, philosophy, legality, medicine, ethics, etc.,
about who is the fetus. And we come on this issue to very different conclusions about that. It's really it's not the only thing that is at the heart of our differences. It's the thing we talk about the most, and some others to me are far more important. But we do see the fetus in different ways. And as I said, I understand that for someone who sees the fetus as a human person, it can be shocking. It can be, you can see the person who has the views that I might have about the fetus as like really, really a cruel, callous human being. But that is the heart of some of the differences that we have, and it doesn't pay to avoid that. I just would also say, we don't have the time on this panel, but I have very strong differences with David on the subject of tragedy. I think and the subject of that which happens by choice and that which happens by nature. I think these are both of these are very complex themes of what is the tragic and I would love, over another drink, not tonight, to spend much more time talking about that. But I'll leave it at that, because I'm starting to stumble.
I'd like to take on the question about the rights and feelings of the man, being the male person. Did you all notice that?
There's one guy in every panel.
Yeah. I would say it's a really interesting and complex question, and I'll take it back a little bit further. I think that overall, a number of cultural developments in the last 40 or 50 years have weakened the ties that bind men and women in society and have set us more and more at odds with each other, in a sense that our interests are more and more at odds with each other. We need each other. Most of the time we recognize this, but we also seem to have a great fragility in our relationships, including our marriages. And so the way that abortion law has been framed has both reflected the weakness and fragility of male-female relationships, and I think has worsened it. And so I totally understand why, if you're going to have legal access to abortion, why it needs to be the woman's choice rather than some kind of consultative process with whoever the man is in the situation. But it still does reflect layers of brokenness in the relationships between men and women in our society that are worth talking about.
Is there time to add something to that? Or I'm happy not to. It's okay with me, but...
Yeah. Well, Mary, you wanted to add.
Oh, well, I wanted to say what you just said, David, brought back very powerfully for me watching certain dialogues where men and women, and particularly men in a dialogue setting, were talking about their experience of abortion, of a woman having an abortion, of a pregnancy they helped to conceive, and and that made me think, dialogue, talking about those issues and how that opened and how startling it was for women to hear men talk in that way about it was quite powerful. So that's sort of the value of dialogue. Just quickly on adoption, I discovered very quickly as we started, we did some work on adoption, that yes, there are strong feelings about adoption, that becomes a whole dialogue in itself sometimes, because you can't, so it would caution to assume that there is unanimity about everything about adoption is a mistake. That's more dialogue.
I live in a very different world from yours, David, I think. My sense of the relationship, and this speaks to what really, some of the things that are behind how we feel about abortion, things like the sexual revolution, how we feel about sex, how we feel about relationships, roles of men, etc. Those deep things affect this. But the world in which I live on this men question is one in which the relationships between men and women are much stronger and much healthier than the relationships I remember from my childhood of men and women. Now, and I think these ways in which we see our worldview around these things so much influence the way in which we look at this. On the men question, you know, 'cause we're starting to get a little bit into standard ways of talking about abortion, the way you do if you're pro-life and the way you do if you're pro-choice. But it seems to me that this part of where I am on abortion, every pregnancy carries with it the risk of death. The relationship between death and pregnancy, historically, built into our unconscious as women, to be pregnant for most of history meant to really risk lots of death. And it still means to risk death. And while I think couples, men and women who care for each other, should negotiate, and that sometimes it's good for a woman who may prefer to have an abortion to, out of love, accede to her partner and give him a child. I think that's a valid decision for a woman to make, as it is for a man to accede to what his partner wants. This is a two-way street, so it has to go both ways. At the human and moral level, in the end, it is the pregnant woman in every pregnancy, even the healthiest pregnancy, that risks the loss of her life. And that consequence does speak something. We disagree on legality, but that consequence has something to say about who decides.
Yeah, we're doing very well. We have 15 minutes.
I'm going to tick off a few more questions.
Let's
respond to people. The role of politicians, Feminists for Life. Politicians need to be able to be the most courageous of all of us because they're the least courageous, in many cases. And, I understand the practical realities of where their money comes from. And I also understand the practical realities of wanting and needing, not just wanting, needing to belong to a community there more than almost anywhere else in order to have success. To pass a bill, you need a quorum, you need a majority, period. So I get that, and that's incredibly challenging. But at the same time, we rely on politicians to put aside their allegiances for the sake of allegiance, where their values and morals and their role as representatives dictate that they should do other than what some of the groups want them to do. And I sympathize with how hard that is to do in practical terms. And I just want to answer also really quickly about disagreement about the morality of adoption, which Curtis, I think, asked. We didn't have disagreement about the morality of adoption, and even more so when I was drafting, when we were working on some of the policies in the Ryan DeLauro bill about adoption, and one of them was actually a public education campaign around adoption, which is a little different than just increasing the tax credit, which was actually in the end part of healthcare reform and passed. That was a little different. Like, what do we want a public education campaign to say about adoption? And we really, and I remember, working on this with Donna and with others, and we were surprisingly, we were cautious around it, but we did not get stopped up talking about that one.
No disagreement whatsoever about the morality of adoption. Adoption is a positive good. It's just good. It gives people who need a child, and it gives the child a family. And it's a no-brainer from my perspective that we want to ease access to adoption, do everything we can to make adoption.
I will add one thing that I just forgot, which is in one of the original versions of the Ryan DeLauro bill, Francis, you may remember this, there was a provision which required like health clinics, in other words, Planned Parenthoods and other such medical clinics, to give information about parenting and to give information about adoption originally. That was one of the provisions. And that originally needed to be modified on the pro-choice side, because the pro-choice side felt like, well, that's great that they're being required to give all that information, but how about also requiring information about family planning at the same time? But then when we added in family planning, it became a problem. For example, if the enforcement mechanism was to take away federal funds if you didn't do this, what about a Catholic group that was providing very good care for pregnant women but didn't want to go into that? So what we did was just take that provision out of the bill. So yes, adoption can stir up things.
So I think, Rachel, you're highlighting something about the political process. A lot of times the general public isn't privy to the conversations that happen in the closed doors. So when a bill comes out, which I think pro-life and pro-choice, those are not necessarily good categories and labels to use, in that most of us support both choice and life, but I'll use them. When people sat down and really rolled up their sleeves and came up with a consensus bill that they felt comfortable in moving forward, the public just sees a final bill, and then they erupt and they say, why isn't this here, and why isn't that there, and why is that there, and this not? So I think that there's some responsibility on us public people who aren't always in the room, sometimes we are, sometimes we're not, to try and learn why that bill is the way it is before we just start attacking them. So the politicians have it very hard.
Where would you? I just throw something totally different out, but you asked about the role of politicians, and I was thinking this happened years and years ago, but the dialogue that started in Wisconsin was because two politicians made it possible. Someone had the idea, a pro-choice woman and a pro-life woman had the idea of dialogue, but they didn't think they could recruit anybody. This was Maggie, and so they went and they found a state legislator who was pro-life and a state legislator who was pro-choice. They were very strong advocates, and those two politicians went to their respective constituencies and said, I think it would be a good idea for you to talk. The two of them were not in the dialogue group, but they put their sort of imprimatur. This is out of the public eye. Now that group later came up with recommendations on sexuality education that went back to the state legislature with those politicians' support. So I only raise that just to say there could be a positive role for people who are politicians who want to encourage their constituencies to help come up with wise policy. Step out of the way, but then be willing to receive it afterwards.
Anything anyone want to add regards to the questions before you have a final commentary?
On the question of using language of fetus versus embryo, I think that it's fairly common in public conversations to use the term fetus as a blanket term while recognizing that in science and so on there are stages and different labels that go with different stages, including multiple labels. And there is some significant discussion in the literature about the possible different moral status at different stages. But I think the term is just generally used in public conversation, fetus, to cover all of those stages.
All right, well, why don't you each have a final word of your choosing? If there's something you learned or valued about this exchange, you could mention that, or something you want to talk more about, or anything else on your mind. Just your final words for this conversation.
I had a good time. Thank you very much.
Okay, two things about advice, not advice, but that I wanted to share from my experience in finding common ground, just as we all move forward in this terrain. The first is, I believe that it's almost always true that each side holds a piece of the truth. And I think these dialogues are more successful if you look for the opposing side's piece of the truth and keep it in mind when you're having dialogue and conversations. And the second thing that I wanted to share from my experience is I believe, And common ground has become this convoluted, controversial term, so I'm going to say shared values. I believe that you can find overlapping shared values with the other side genuinely, without compromising your core values and without the other side feeling that they've had to compromise their core values. Because we did it. We did it. And I just want to give you that piece of hope and optimism as you embark on in the process.
That's really fascinating because I was about to say the exact same thing with a little bit of a different image. I was thinking of an orchestra and how there are so many different instruments needed to produce a piece of music. And that was my way of also saying that everyone holds some of the information, truth, necessary for moving society forward. And not an orchestra in the sense that you have a director, because I play violin, you can conduct an orchestra without one. But that we really need to listen to each other and then trust each other so that when that piece of music is created, that people's best interests were considered, and to remember that before just attacking what's created.
I would say there were abortions before Roe versus Wade. There have been abortions since Roe versus Wade. And some, at least on the pro-life side, are coming to understand that the goal of changing Roe versus Wade and reversing that can't be the focus or not the only focus. And that because the day after that would happen, there would still be people facing crises who needed somebody to care for them. And the same work that we're talking about now would be relevant then as it was before 1973. And so 1.2 million abortions a year, whatever we can do to get to the root causes of that and reduce the demand together, meeting people's needs holistically, is what we need to be working on. And that's several of the panels at this conference will be dealing with those specific issues.
I would just suggest that you keep in mind that there's a value in dialogue, even if you're not prepared to sign on to the Common Ground movement or the Shared Values movement. So don't get discouraged or don't feel you have no role to play in dialogue or there's no value in dialogue. If your goal is to understand better, which is a lot of what happened here today, and to be understood better, go for the dialogue. You have no idea where that will lead you, but that in and of itself, your shared value may be that you're a person with integrity like I am, and that if we can sort of witness that acknowledgement in society, that itself has value. So there's many dialogue tables and they do different things. And even if they're not coming up with joint policy legislation, they can have real value for people and their communities.
Yeah. No, I said mine.
Okay. Well,
I have announcements, but I'll wait till.
Okay. Well, we're off to a really good start. I knew I would be lucky to be able to hear all of you talk, and I was. And I also was very mindful of all of you. This has been a long session. It's been longer than I think any of the other panels, and I've been very aware of the quality of attention and the really great questions that were asked. So thanks to all of you for getting us off to such a good start.
Break now. How long should people take, Peter? Half an hour?
4 o'clock here.
Okay, half an hour break. But we also this is a very fortunate gathering, and so we have some fortunate gifts for everybody who is here. These are fortune cookies, and there's one for each of you. And there is a special message just for you inside each cookie. So there's some for the people at this table. There's one for you. And there's one for you. Oh, I missed David. And there are 3 bags of them here, so please come and take a fortune cookie, see what your fortune is, and be back here in a half hour sharp. Thank you very much for your attention.